Okay, we are working on the Sabbath day. We've spent 2 Sundays on it to show actually what it is and what our requirements are to it. For those that have missed, let me go through a couple of points on a catch-up, and then we'll get into where we left off last week. Remember that there are 3 main views in professing Christendom regarding the observance of a Sabbath day. This is on wheels, and I almost pulled a Biden and fell down on the floor. There are 3 main views in professing Christendom. There are those that hold that the 7th-day Sabbath of the 10 Commandments is still in effect, and that Christians should observe it under the Lord as a holy day of rest and worship. And as I've pointed out over the last couple of weeks, there's a lot of rules regarding the Sabbath day. There's a lot of things that you can't do on the Sabbath day if you're observing the Sabbath day. For one thing, you can't travel more than 3/4 of a mile on the Sabbath day. So none of us would be able to come to church if we followed that. You cannot kindle a fire in your house, which means you can't turn the power on the Sabbath day. So no heat in the winter, no air conditioning in the summer, no warm food to eat on the Sabbath day. That's all going to be warmed up before the sun goes down on Friday, and then you're done with any power until Saturday night. So most of the food in your freezer, some of it's going to go bad. It's just really, nobody follows any of that stuff. They don't follow any of the rules. They just say you're supposed to keep the Sabbath, but that's how you keep the Sabbath, is by following the rules. So they try to keep the law by breaking the law. And as I've been showing you, as I'm going to finally get to today, today, hopefully, we'll get to the end of this, and you will see what the Sabbath is in the New Testament. You will actually see what it is. In the Old Testament, it was a shadow. And you remember, I don't have a bright light where I can do a bunny rabbit or a shark up here on the screen, but you know what a shadow is. It's not really the thing, it's a picture of a thing. And it usually doesn't end up being that exact thing anyway. So that's what the Sabbath was. So there are those that hold that the 7th day is still in effect. Then there are those, and we've got a guy that I quoted last week, I'm going to quote him a couple more times this week, that believe that the Sabbath day transferred from the 7th day to the 1st day. But all of the rest of the Sabbath stuff is still in place. It's just we do it on Sunday rather than Saturday. Okay? There's that group. And then there are those that hold, like us, that the Sabbath day was a shadow of things to come. That it was actually one of the things that was fulfilled in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, that he took care of that. And we're going to see how it's been reformed when we get to the end of the study this morning, okay? We defined the word Sabbath as a day of rest or repose, a cessation from labor or work. I want you to remember that. I want you to just take the word Sabbath and change it in your mind to the word rest. And wherever you see the word Sabbath, I want you to start looking at it and seeing the word rest. Because when we get to the end, you're going to see what the rest is. Okay? Okay. Now, another point was that the law of Moses ordained various Sabbaths. There wasn't just the weekly Sabbath. Passover had 2 Sabbaths in it. Tabernacles had Sabbaths. The Feast of Trumpets had, all of the feasts, there were more than just the weekly Sabbath. And all of the rules applied to those Sabbaths as well as the weekly Sabbath. So if we're going to keep the Sabbath, does that mean we have to keep the feasts? Does that mean we have to start keeping the Passover as well? Is that another one that we're required to do? God commanded it. It was a Sabbath. It was a day of rest. There was a holy convocation on that day. You had to attend church, but you couldn't travel more than 3/4 of a mile, so none of us could go to church because we lived too far away. Now, it would work in first century Jerusalem because, as I pointed out in my study on the Olivet Discourse, the first century Jerusalem was not much bigger than Lake Hollingsworth. So you go downtown and look at Lake Hollingsworth and go out to the center of the street that goes around Lake Hollingsworth, and that's the size, roughly, of first century Jerusalem. So you could travel within that city, but it wasn't anywhere near as big as Lakeland. It certainly was not. You couldn't get in the car and drive to Tampa. Of course, you couldn't get in a car anyway, but you get the point. You couldn't travel that far. No work was to be done on the Sabbath. Another point, the commandment to keep the Sabbath was given to the nation of Israel only. Not that thing that's over in the Middle East today. It was given to the nation of Israel only. That nation became a nation when Moses and the children of Israel walked across the Red Sea. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't trust God, and then they settled in the land of Canaan. And they were in the land of Canaan, in and out of the land of Canaan, until 70 AD, when that put an end, put a period on the nation of Israel. So from Moses to Titus, there was the nation of Israel, and the Sabbath was given to them. Now, in reality, the Sabbath ended 40 years before 70 AD. It ended when Christ died on the cross. That was the end of actual legal end of it. But like with a lot of things, you have a legal end and then you have an actual physical end later. The Civil War here in America ended in April of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. But the war didn't end for another 6 months or so. There was still fighting. Word hadn't gotten out yet. So there was a legal end and an actual end later. It's the same way here. A legal end when Christ died, an actual end when they were taken out of the land in 40 AD, or 70 AD, I'm sorry, 40 years later. But that's who it was given to. Now, some argue that the Ten Commandments are the moral law and they're binding upon all men for all time, and we covered that last week. Christians are not under the law of Moses, which is also known as the Old Covenant. Christians are under the New Covenant, the New Testament. Covenant and Testament there being synonymous terms. So we follow what the New Testament tells us. We're not obliged to all of the Old Testament stuff. We're obliged to what was brought into the New Testament from the Old. So there were laws that were in place before Moses ever wrote the Ten Commandments. Before the Ten Commandments were given to Israel, you couldn't murder. That was already against the law. There were already laws that were there. And many of the laws, in fact, as we covered last week, 9 of the Ten Commandments were recodified in the New Testament. And we gave you the verses last week. So 9 of them have moved over. The Sabbath is missing. That one's not in there. There's no commandment in the New Testament to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy, because it was a shadow. And as I'm going to show you what the real thing is this morning, Lord willing. Now, that gets us caught up. Now, there are some that will divide Moses' law into the ceremonial law and the moral law. They'll divide them into 2 sections. And they contend that whereas the ceremonial law has been set aside, the moral law is still in effect. Okay? So, they contend that the 4th commandment of the Sabbath day is part of the moral law and that it's still in effect. That's how they try to get around to the idea that we should only worship on the Sabbath day. Now, the New Testament speaks of the law of Moses in four different ways, four different aspects that we're going to look at this morning. It refers to it as a singular. It's a singular thing. Moses' law is singular. It has aspects to it, some that are moral and some that are ceremonial, some that are prophetical, but it's a singular unit. It's not three different, so you don't have the ceremonial law, the prophetical law, and the moral law. It's not broken down like that. It's one unit that has three different aspects. It's kind of like God. God is one God that has three different persons within him. But he's one God. He's singular with three different persons. Okay? Now I know that's hard to wrap your head around, but I'll give you a real stupid illustration. I am a husband, I am a father, and I am a son. But I'm just one guy with three different aspects. And I relate to those three different groups differently. Okay? So the law is singular. Let's look at some verses. John chapter 1 and verse 17. John 1:17. For the law, singular, was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. The law is a singular thing. Look at Matthew chapter 5. Beginning at verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. The law is a singular thing with various aspects. Now it's time to chase a rabbit. He says that not one jot or one tittle will fall from the law. You know, there is a group of people that teach that Jesus taught from a Greek New Testament called the Septuagint. It is the Old Testament text of the Roman Catholic Church. The Septuagint is. Our book order in our King James Bible follows the book order of the Septuagint. It does not follow the book order of the Masoretic Hebrew. But the interesting point here is if Jesus used a Greek Bible, like so many of these scholars teach that he did, then why would he refer to a jot and a tittle? You know what a jot, if you look at a Hebrew alphabet and you look at the little characters, some of the letters have these little curly cues on the end of them that differentiate them from another letter. That's called a jot. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's called a tittle. Those little things are called tittles. Jot is another name for the letter yod in the Hebrew alphabet, and that's the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. These things don't refer to Greek, they refer to Hebrew. The point that I'm making is that if not one jot or one tittle will fall from the law, Jesus Christ is referring to a Hebrew Bible, not a Greek one, okay? But the law is, again, singular. Look at John chapter 8 and verse 17. It is also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. Written in your law, not laws. Law is singular. Now, if we want to look at the law in a moral sense, let's look at some of these. Look at Matthew chapter 22. beginning at verse 36. Matthew 22:36. Where Christ is asked a question, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now you see, that's a moral sense. That's not ceremonial. You're not sacrificing anything here. But it's in that same law that's singular. So there are aspects of the law that teach us morality. Just like here in the New Testament, there's times when I will teach sermons on doctrinal and I will teach sermons on practical. So you've got doctrinal Christianity, you've got practical Christianity. Sometimes I'm up here teaching you how you're supposed to behave. Sometimes I'm up here teaching you what you ought to believe. Okay? Doctrinal and practical. Well, this is teaching morality, how you're to live, things that you're supposed to practice, but it's not teaching ceremonial law where you're showing up with a calf or a lamb or whatever it is that you're going to sacrifice. Okay? That's what I mean by that. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23. Christ says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now, you know what a hypocrite is? It's somebody that claims to do something that they ain't doing, right? For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not leave the other undone. These Pharisees were so particular when it came to their tithing that if they had an herb garden growing in their windowsill and they had parsley and sage and so on, which is what cumin and those things are, they're herbs, that they would make sure that 10% of their parsley that grew that week would go to the temple. And they would require you to make sure that you took 10% of your rosemary and thyme, not you, but you know, the herb rosemary, that you would take 10% of that and you'd have to give that. If you didn't, then you were in trouble and you broke the law. Now, they didn't care about mercy or judgment or justice or faith or any of that stuff, which was also part of the law, but they zeroed in on these other aspects. And so that's a brief view of the law in a moral sense. And you will find throughout the Bible different morality pictures being taught within the law, but it's still the same law. Now, let's look at it in a ceremonial sense. Look at Luke chapter 2. Beginning at verse 22. Now, this is after Jesus has been born, and this is Mary going to the temple after he had been born to do what was required in the law when a woman had born a child. Okay? So this is ceremonial. This is part of the ceremony part. Okay, verse 22. And when the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Ceremonial law. The law of Moses had aspects of it that were ceremonial. Okay, and this is one. Romans chapter 9 and verse 4. Romans 9 and verse 4, where Paul says, "Who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promises." So you see, Israel was given this. This ceremonial aspect of the law was given to Israel. That was there. It wasn't given to us. God never told a Gentile to celebrate Passover according to the way that he told the Israelites to. This was something that was given to Israel, especially the ceremonial sense of it. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Verses 8 and 9. Well, let's go back a little bit to get context here. Go back to verse 5. "Have we not power to lead about a sister or a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas, have not we power to forbear working? Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man?" Now this is where we were going. "Or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn." Now how is that a ceremonial sense? It's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for you to take your hard-earned money and stick some of it in the box for the church. That's a sacrifice. I recognize that. That is a sacrifice. That makes it ceremonial. Okay? And there are aspects of the law that were ceremonial. Look at Galatians chapter 4. And verse 21. "Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law?" Those that want, let's get back to this Sabbath thing. The people that want to keep the Sabbath, and yet they want to get in their car on Saturday during the Sabbath, and they want to drive downtown, and they want to go to the shopping mall. They want to go to a restaurant and have a nice meal. They want to break all of the rules concerning the Sabbath. Do you not hear the law? You want to be under the law? Have you not read it? Do you not see what all's involved in it? There's more to it than just lip service. So to the Galatians, they were starting to drift into this idea that they wanted to be under the law again, which was a burden. Peter says that no man could bear. Why do you want to climb? Have you bothered to read what's in there? Because if you'd read it, you wouldn't want to be under the law. So we have the law in a ceremonial sense. Now let's look at the law in a prophetical sense. Look at Luke chapter 24. And verse 44. And he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. A couple of points. You see, the law had prophetical aspects to it. The law prophesied of Christ coming. And in one place he said, if you had read Moses, you'd recognize me. If you knew Moses, you'd know who I was, because he prophesied of me. There were aspects of Moses' law You take Moses' law is generally that first section of the Bible. It covers the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what's referred to as the Torah or the law. And in the Hebrew Bible, the law is broken down into 3 sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings or the Psalms. And that's exactly what Christ is referring to again. We looked at one where he talked about the jot and the tittle, obviously a Hebrew Bible. Here again, he's referring to a Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint is not broken down this way. The Septuagint is broken down the same way that our King James Bible is broken down, where you've got the law, you've got the historical books, you've got the Psalms, you've got the prophetical books, both major and minor, broken down completely differently. It's a different setup. So if you're talking about what's in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, you're referring to a Hebrew Bible. That's what we had, what he had back then. And that Hebrew Bible, that law, prophesied of things that were to come. Look at John chapter 12 and verse 34. The people answered him, "We have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever. And how sayest thou, the Son of Man must be lifted up?" Who is the Son of Man? You see, the law had prophesied that Christ would come and that he'd live forever. That is a prophetical aspect of the law. It did have that. In John chapter 15, beginning at verse 24. "If I had not done among them the works which none other man did, they had not had sin. But now have they both seen and hated both me and my Father. But this cometh to pass, that the word might be fulfilled that is written in their law." A prophecy that was written in their law. "They hated me without a cause." You know, I made a point last week. In the law, there is a very specific, very complicated ceremony that has to take place whenever a leper, not the cat, whenever a leper was healed. And it's in the book of Leviticus. It takes up a whole chapter on what to do when a leper is healed. And it involves 2 birds, and you kill one of the birds in a pot, and then you dip the other bird in the blood of the first bird, and you let that bird fly away, and on and on and on and on and on it goes. And for 1,500 years, these guys had to know this law. They had to hand it down from one generation to another. And you realize that no leper was ever cleansed in Israel from the time that law started until Christ walked on the face of the earth. For 1,500 years they had this law, and nobody ever used it until Christ showed up, and then they were using it like 7 times a day, constant. And they missed it. They absolutely missed it. And here, well, I don't want to get into that. That would be another sermon. Maybe I'll preach on that someday, on what all of that refers to. But so we have these prophetical aspects. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Some of you might remember that last week I cut off maybe a little bit early because I said that the next section was going to take a while. And I think now you're seeing why I cut off a little bit early. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 21. "In the law it is written," here's a prophecy of something that was going to take place. "In the law it is written, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak to this people, and yet for all that they will not hear me, saith the Lord." You see, the time of tongues, speaking in other languages that you've never learned before, that was in prophecy. It was written in the law that it would happen, and it happened in the 1st century AD. Look at Hebrews chapter 10, and then we'll move on from this point. Verses 8 through 10. Hebrews 10, 8 through 10. Above when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hast pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second, by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. You see, this was a prophecy in the Old Testament, in the law, referring to the time that Christ would come, and that it would set a bunch of stuff aside. So we have these different aspects of this one singular law. It has a ceremonial aspect. It has a prophetical aspect. It has a moral aspect, but it's one law, okay? It's not broken down. There's not a moral law and a ceremonial law. There is a law with 3 different aspects to it, okay? So since it's a single unit, when it was displaced by the New Testament, the whole law was displaced by the New Testament. Their claim is that only the ceremonial aspect was displaced, but all the rest of it still applies. No, it was one law. An appeal to the law of Moses alone isn't sufficient to establish a Sabbath day for the New Testament church. And you'll remember last week we looked at the verses that support 9 of the 10 commandments being codified in the New Testament. And those 9 commandments were to follow. They're over there. They're in the New Testament. But there's no writer ever told us that we had to maintain the Sabbath. The 4th commandment, to remember the Sabbath day, it's not included in the commandments codified in the New Testament. It's not there. Now, let me give you some additional arguments that are made by folks that want to hang on to this Sabbath thing. And for the benefit of those that haven't heard this already, some people might think, well, why would we even worry about something like this? Because there's a bunch of people out there that believe this stuff. And we've actually lost members that got caught up into this thing and got convinced that the Sabbath day thing is more important than they realized because they didn't know what it was. And sometimes people are very convincing with their arguments. So here's some of the arguments that are made by people that advocate a Sabbath day. Argument number 1 is that Christ inferred an obligation to observe the Sabbath day in Matthew 24 and verse 20. Now, many of you were on the Bible studies on the Olivet Discourse. And so this is going to make a whole lot more sense to you if you understand the Olivet Discourse. And I want you to remember that the majority of people today are what you would term futurists. And so they look at these passages and they think they're still future, when in fact they were finished almost 2,000 years ago. This was these verses deal with a prophecy that was completed almost 2,000 years ago, but they think that they're still future, okay? Which is what you would have to think in order to come up with the idea that this verse is obligating people to a Sabbath day in this time. Matthew 24 and verse 20. But pray that your flight be not in the winter neither on the Sabbath day. Now, let's move back a couple of verses. Those of you that were in the Bible study, this will make sense to you. Verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. And you'll remember that we showed you from Luke's gospel that this abomination of desolation was a city being compassed with armies. Cestius circled the city in 66 AD to come and destroy it, and then for some unknown reason pulled up stake and left. And Christ had told the believers in Jerusalem that when you see this city compassed with armies, it's time to get out. Okay? It goes on, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains, and let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that you, why? Because it's hard to travel with babies. That's why. It's tough to have, especially when all you can do is walk. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Okay? Now, Daniel Wilson, the guy that I quoted last week from his book, The Lord's Day, and remember, he is one that argues against the Sabbath day on Saturday, but wants to observe the Sabbath day on Sunday. And his book is called The Lord's Day. So he's in that area. He's in that group number 2 that still think the Sabbath is required, but they just change the date from Saturday to Sunday. Okay? Now this is what he says. He bids them to pray that their flight be not in the winter nor on the Sabbath day, as these 2 impediments, the one from the nature of the season, the other from the obligation of the 4th commandment, would obstruct their escape. The observation cannot be expounded by any superstitious fears of violating a ceremonial or mosaical precept, or even the tradition of the elders, because flight under imminent peril was allowed by the Pharisaic traditions. The argument, therefore, is unanswerable. What he's saying is that if you're in imminent peril, you can break the Sabbath rule. Somebody's chasing you, you can travel more than 3/4 of a mile to get away from them on the Sabbath day. If you're trying to somehow defend yourself by running from this guy, well, that's allowed. So if you're going to say that Jesus is going to put this obligation on the Sabbath day, when his instructions are that you are going to be in imminent peril if you don't leave town when the city's circled, then the Pharisees aren't going to stop you in that case, right? Why would they? So why would he have to make that's what Daniel Wilson's saying. Why would you even have to say that? Because nobody's going to stop you if you're in imminent peril at the time, okay? That would be Jesus advocating a stricter observance of the Sabbath day than the Pharisees did, one that would even imperil life. When Jesus himself taught that it was lawful to save life on the Sabbath day. You don't need to turn here, I'll flip over here real quick. Mark chapter 3 and verse 4. He saith unto them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. You see, you could save life on the Sabbath day. That was okay. The problem is that not believing the words of the Lord Jesus, the Pharisees would not have perceived the imminent peril and would have restrained the travel. Because Cestius circles the city and then he leaves. If you don't believe what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, that coming after that is going to be trouble, Well, you're going to think everything's just hunky-dory because they pulled up stake and left. So now you can't travel on the Sabbath day. That was the purpose of what he was saying there. You know, because the Pharisees will stop you on the Sabbath day. And I want you to understand something. Jesus was speaking to Jewish believers that lived in Jerusalem in the 1st century AD. That's extremely important to understand. He was not speaking to Gentile Christians living in Huntsville, Alabama, or Blytheville, Arkansas in the 21st century AD. He was speaking to Jewish believers that lived in Jerusalem at the time that this occurred in 70 AD. So his statement to pray that their flight be not on the Sabbath day in no way teaches that the Sabbath was to be observed throughout all ages, but rather that the unbelieving Pharisees would enforce it because they wouldn't recognize the fact that they were in imminent peril and wouldn't allow the traffic. Okay, another argument. The Sabbath commandment being taken for granted, there's no reenactment in the New Testament. In other words, the reason that there's no commandment in the New Testament is because it's just assumed that it moved over. Here's Daniel Wilson again, and there's a couple of things in here that I'm going to comment on, but a reenactment of the Sabbath in the New Testament would be a denial by implication of its previous institution and authority. Nothing is enacted in the gospel without a necessity. The baptism of infants, watch where we're going with this one. The baptism of infants is not expressly enjoined. Yeah, no kidding. It doesn't say anywhere that you're to baptize babies. You're right on that point. The New Testament does not say that. The law of circumcision, having sufficiently provided for it, the moral law, the essential duties of religion, the relations of man to his maker and benefactor, the necessity of a season for divine worship, the proportion of time destined for it from the creation, all the precepts of the Decalogue remain unchanged. They're taken for granted under the gospel. They are not again formally promulgated. Creation and Mount Sinai suffice. So what Mr. Wilson is saying, or I should say Dr. Wilson, I want to be respectful here, what he is saying is that you didn't have to recodify it. It was already there, just like everything else. And the reason we baptize babies is because the law of circumcision. Okay. If a reenactment, which is his terminology, or a restating of it isn't necessary, why are there commandments in the New Testament regarding idolatry, regarding adultery, regarding theft, regarding honoring your parents? Why are they formally promulgated in the New Testament? If it's not necessary, why did he have to restate all of these things? Look at 1 John chapter 5 and verse 21. Little children, keep yourself from idols. You see, we're commanded to stay away from idolatry. Well, why did he have to mention it here if it automatically passed over? Why did he specifically say it? I've already said there were 9 of the 10 commandments recodified in the New Testament. Why? Why did they recodify all 9 of those and not the Sabbath if it wasn't necessary and if it actually ended up being a denial of the original, which is what this bonehead says. Look at Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth? For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no more adulteress, though she be married to another man. Now we know that there's a couple of other exceptions here. This is not going to be a sermon on marriage and divorce in the church. I've already done that. We know that if you're married to an unbeliever and they depart and abandon you, you're free to remarry again. So, but the law didn't cover that. We got that in the New Testament. That was a clarification in the New Testament. The law simply said, one and you're done. Now, there's a time when the Pharisees came to Christ and said, well, aren't you allowed to divorce your wife for any reason? And Jesus said, that's not the way it was in the beginning. Because of the hardness of your heart, God suffered you to do that, but that's not the way it was designed. Okay? So now, we've already looked at a commandment against idolatry. Now we've looked at one against adultery, have we not? Being brought over into the New Testament. How about Ephesians chapter 4? I'm not going to go through all 9 of them this morning, but Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Theft, right? That's one of the commandments from the Old Testament that's brought over. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Children, hear this one. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. That's one of the 10 commandments, honoring your father and your mother. Now, that does not mean that you have to allow your father and mother to take advantage of you. I was blessed in that, I guess blessed, my father and mother never lived long enough for me to have to take care of them financially, which is a good thing, because they were blessed in that they didn't need it. I think, I was trying to think about this. When my dad retired, he quit working. I remember very clearly, it was the day after Wendy's 22nd birthday. We were dating. I worked nights, got home early in the morning, went to her apartment. She was going to cook me breakfast. The Challenger took off from Cape Canaveral and exploded. Some of you might remember that. That was January 26th of 1986. And I remember looking at Wendy and saying, my dad's going to have to go to the Cape, because he worked for Rockwell International and they were the ones that built the Challenger, and he had to go to the Cape. So I know he was still working then, but I think he retired close to a year after that. And then my mother retired right after that, and they never lifted a finger as long as they lived off their savings until they finally passed away. My mom passed away in 2008. So when it came from that standpoint, I never had to help them out financially. They had to help me financially, but I was always there for them. I mean, I never said no. I never turned down a request. So I think I honored them in that sense. But the hooker here is in the Lord. Honor your father and your mother. But it doesn't mean you have to be taken advantage of. Give them the respect they deserve. Okay, now, we see that the commandments regarding idolatry, adultery, theft, and honoring parents are formally promulgated in the New Testament. And Daniel says that it's not required. He also says that the law of circumcision is the reason that we're to baptize infants. So here's a question. Why would you baptize a baby girl? No baby girl under the Old Testament was circumcised. None of them. So why would you baptize a baby girl if you're going to use circumcision as your reason? And you know what? Circumcision is another thing that was not transferred into the New Testament. Not at all. Okay, next point. Isaiah prophesied of converted eunuchs and strangers keeping the Sabbath in New Testament times. Look at Isaiah chapter 56. Isaiah 56, beginning at verse 1. Thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of the stranger that has joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. Even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord, to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. The Lord God, which gathered the outcasts of Israel, saith, yet will I gather others to him beside those that are gathered unto him. You say, what in the world is that talking about? Well, and why would you say that's a prophecy of the New Testament? Well, it's a prophecy of the New Testament because this sets forth something that would have never occurred in the Old Testament. Never would this have occurred in Old Testament times. Turn first to Ezekiel chapter 44. In verse 9, thus saith the Lord God, no stranger, uncircumcised in heart nor uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter into my sanctuary of any stranger that is among the children of Israel. Gentiles were not allowed in God's church. That's what strangers are in the Old Testament. So they're not going to be keeping the Sabbath in God's house if they're not allowed to go in there. The only ones that were would be ones that had converted to Judaism and had become circumcised, in which case they're no longer strangers. Okay? Uncircumcised strangers were not allowed there. If you remember what happened with one of the charges against the Apostle Paul was that he had brought an uncircumcised, probably Titus, but he had brought an uncircumcised Gentile into the temple, when in reality he hadn't, but they assumed that he did because he'd been traveling with them. And that was one of the charges that when he appealed to Caesar. So this can't be talking about Old Testament. Look also at Deuteronomy chapter 23. In verse 1, he that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Eunuchs weren't allowed in the church in the Old Testament. So strangers and eunuchs could not be in God's house celebrating the Sabbath, which is what we read about over in Isaiah. So it has to be a prophecy of the New Testament. It can't be a prophecy of the Old. Because under the Old Testament, neither strangers nor eunuchs were admitted into God's house. Isaiah was clearly predicting the New Testament times when the Gentiles and the eunuchs would be admitted into God's house. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 Timothy 3:15, but if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. In the New Testament time, Gentiles and eunuchs are allowed in the church. You will remember the Ethiopian eunuch that was baptized by Philip over in the book of Acts and became the first non-resident member of the Jerusalem church. So, now I'm going to give away a secret here. I'm going to give away the secret, and then I'm going to flesh it out a little bit more. Remember I said that you have to remember what the word Sabbath is and replace it with the word rest. Believing on the Lord Jesus Christ and the true doctrine of salvation by the grace of God and the faith of Jesus Christ is keeping the New Testament Sabbath. That is keeping the New Testament Sabbath. Believing in the true gospel and worshiping God in spirit and truth is keeping the New Testament the New Testament Sabbath. Remember, shadow and reality. Look at Hebrews chapter 4. Verses 2 and 3. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. Now, who he's talking about here are the children in the wilderness when they'd come across the Red Sea. The gospel was preached to them. Unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. To enter into God's rest, you have to cease from your own works. You have to quit trying to work your way into heaven. And the Jews refused to do that. They did not believe him. They believe that you got to keep the law and you got to do this and you got to do that. You got to do something else. You got to work your way into heaven. And the only way to get into God's rest is to quit trying to work your way into heaven, and then you rest from your own works. And that's what these eunuchs and these strangers had done in New Testament times. They believed the truth, pressed into it, and therefore were keeping God's rest, or Sabbath, if you will. Now, the Sabbath does establish the principle that men and beasts need rest. In fact, Jesus called his disciples and told them to rest for a while over in Mark chapter 6 and 31. In Psalm chapter 127, Psalm 127, verses 1 and 2. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman walketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows. For so he giveth his beloved sleep. Sleep is a gift from God. And this is interesting. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. You want to know how churches get started? God starts them. God finds a group of people in a specific area, and that group of people somehow get a hankering to try to study the truth, and the next thing you know, they end up talking to a preacher, and then the preacher comes out and preaches to them, and the next thing you know, a church is found, is started. And if God builds the church, then it's here. For men to go out and try to do it on your own, you're wasting your time. All these ideas of guys going out there and trying to evangelize and start churches when there's nobody there to start it for, God's not building it. You're doing it in vain. Every church that we fellowship was started because some group of people somewhere got together and ended up bumping into a pastor somewhere, and the next thing you know, there's a church founded. That's how God does it. That's how we know where we're supposed to go, because the phone rings. So, men should rest, but there's no specific requirement as to which day. There's no requirement of that. And Christ gives a rest to the believer that transcends the rest of the Old Testament Sabbath day. Let's go back to Hebrews again. Hebrews chapter 4. And we'll read, we're going to read down to verse 11. Hebrews 4, beginning of verse 1 down to verse 11. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. This is what we already saw. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not because of unbelief. Again, he limited a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, Harden not your hearts. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. So there's a rest that's given. And now Paul is quoting Psalm chapter 94 when he says about David. Again, he limited the certain days, saying in David. That's a quote from Psalm 94. I'm sorry, Psalm 95 and verse 11. Let's go back a little bit just for the because he's talking about the children of Israel wandering around in the wilderness. In verse 10 it says, 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and I said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. You see, they didn't believe him. They didn't believe God. They didn't trust God. They complained the whole 40 years that he wasn't taking care of them. We should have moved back to Egypt. We would have been better off there than we would wandering around out in this wilderness. That's unbelief. That's not trusting God. And that's not entering into the rest that God was talking about. And David says that the unbelieving Jews would not enter into God's rest. Why? Because they were unbelievers. And it says that we must not only not come short, we must not even seem to come short of it. We're told in 1 Thessalonians 5:22, avoid all appearance of evil. If you start to complain that God's not taking care of you, you're starting to lose out on this. That's evil to complain about that. And the gospel was preached to Israel in the wilderness as well as unto us. It didn't profit them because they didn't have faith, they didn't believe the message, and they didn't believe the messenger. We're told in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 13 that God's word works effectually only in them that believe. It will only work effectually if you believe it. If you doubt it, it's not going to work. You look at a verse that says, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And you doubt that because you've always thought that God loves everybody. Well, you're not going to understand the doctrine. You're not going to get to the rest if you're going to take bad ideas and keep hanging on to things that you've been taught before that don't line up. You've got to believe the word. You remember this in our study of the faith of Abraham. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Didn't say he believed in him, said he believed him. So when God said he created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, Abraham believed him. He believed what God said. If you believe what God says, you will enter into his rest. If you don't believe him and you doubt, then you won't. And if you're going to keep the Sabbath, you got to enter into his rest, which is what Sabbath means. We're coming up close here, and I don't want to... Okay, back to, well, we're here. Hebrews chapter 4. We haven't moved on yet. Let me find this. Verse 11, let us labor therefore to enter into that rest. You see, there's a rest that's remaining to the people of God beyond the Sabbath day. That rest The rest in verse 9, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. That word rest is translated from the word sabbatismos, and refers to a keeping of the Sabbath. That's what the word sabbatismos means, keeping of the Sabbath. There remaineth therefore a keeping of the Sabbath to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest has also ceased from his own works. You see, there remains that. That is the keeping of the Sabbath, ceasing from your own works. And folks, there's only one church on planet Earth that teaches that, and that's the type of church you're sitting in this morning. All of the rest of them are going to just keep yelling at you. You got to keep this. You got to do this law. You got to accept Christ as your personal Savior. You got to get down on your knees and pray for Him to come into your heart. You got to do all of this other stuff in order to become a child of God. And that's not entering into God's rest, and it's not keeping God's Sabbath in the New Testament. To keep God's Sabbath in the New Testament, you've got to believe the truth and cease from your own works. You see, holding on to the truth, you don't work to try to get to heaven anymore. Now, you work to try to enter into fellowship with God, and you try to do good because you'll be blessed in doing good more than you will in doing evil, but none of that has to do with anything relative to whether or not you go to heaven or not. You cease from your own works. You press into the kingdom of God, and you've entered into and you are keeping God's Sabbath, because the Sabbath was a shadow of us in the New Testament church believing the truth and worshiping God in spirit and truth. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention. I hope that's been helpful. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.